The penthouse was silent, save for the faint hum of Manhattan's pulse 30 stories below. Julian Carver, billionaire tech mogul, lay motionless on his leather couch, eyes half closed, feigning sleep under the dim glow of a single lamp. He wasn't tired, not even close, but he needed answers, and tonight he'd get them. Julian's life was a fortress of control, a sprawling empire built on algorithms, acquisitions, and an unshakable reputation. At 42, he'd conquered Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and every skeptic who dared question his rise from a foster kid to a titan. But control came at a cost. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not after the betrayals, the leaks, the vultures circling his fortune. So when his longtime maid, Rosa, began acting cagey, her nervous glances darting toward her son, Ethan, Julian's instincts screamed. Something was off. Rosa had been with him for a decade, her steady hands keeping his Upper East Side penthouse immaculate, her quiet loyalty a rare constant in his chaotic world. But Ethan, her 24-year-old son, was a wild card. Openly gay, fiercely independent, and freshly hired as a part-time assistant to manage Julian's overflowing inbox, Ethan was an enigma. He was sharp, quick-witted, with eyes that seemed to see through Julian's polished exterior, and that unnerved him. Tonight, Julian had set a trap. He'd left a stack of sensitive documents, fakes of course, on his desk, marked with confidential merger details. If Ethan was the leak Julian suspected, he'd take the bait. Julian slowed his breathing, his body lax, waiting for the sound of footsteps. The penthouse's open layout gave him a clear line of sight to the desk, where the papers sat like a silent challenge. Ethan slipped into the room, his sneakers silent on the hardwood. Julian's pulse quickened, but he kept still, watching through slitted eyes. Ethan's curly blonde hair caught the lamplight, his slim frame moving with a grace that felt almost deliberate. He paused by the desk, his fingers hovering over the documents. Julian's jaw tightened. Got you. But Ethan didn't touch the papers. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket, scribbling something with a pen he'd fished from his jeans. He glanced at Julian, his expression unreadable, then tucked the notebook away and moved toward the kitchen. Julian's mind raced. What was he writing? Why hadn't he taken the bait? The truth was, Julian didn't want Ethan to be guilty. There was something about the young man. His quiet defiance, the way he'd roll his eyes at Julian's curt orders but still get the job done, that stirred something in Julian. Something he hadn't felt since his own youth, when he'd buried his desires under ambition and fear. Julian was bisexual, a secret he'd guarded fiercely, even from himself. Relationships were liabilities. Love was a risk he'd never taken. Yet Ethan's presence was a crack in his armor, and Julian hated how it made him feel vulnerable, exposed. Ethan returned, carrying a glass of water. He set it on the coffee table near Julian, his movements careful, almost tender. You don't have to fake it, Ethan said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. Julian's eyes snapped open, his heart lurching. Ethan's lips curved into a half-smile, but his eyes held something deeper. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. I know you're not asleep. You've been watching me all night. Julian sat up, his facade crumbling. What are you playing at, Ethan? His voice was sharp, but his chest felt tight. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned against the armrest, his gaze steady. I'm not the one playing games, Mr. Carver. You left those papers out to test me, didn't you? The air between them crackled. Julian's mind scrambled for a response, but Ethan's honesty disarmed him. Why didn't you take them? Julian asked, his voice quieter now, almost a plea. Ethan shrugged, but his eyes didn't waver. Because I'm not a thief, and I'm not here to betray you. I'm here because Mom needed help, and I needed a job. That's it. He paused, then added, But you don't trust anyone, do you? The question hit like a punch. Julian stood, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The skyline glittered, indifferent to his turmoil. Ethan was right, he didn't trust. Not Rosa, not Ethan, not even himself. But standing there, with Ethan's gaze boring into him, Julian felt something shift. Maybe it wasn't Ethan he was testing. Maybe it was himself. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a fixture in Julian's life. He wasn't just an assistant. He was a presence, organizing Julian's schedule with ruthless efficiency, challenging his decisions with a boldness that bordered on reckless, and filling the penthouse with a warmth Julian hadn't realized he craved. They'd work late into the night. Ethan sprawled on the couch with his laptop, Julian at his desk, the space between them shrinking with every shared laugh, every fleeting glance. One evening, as rain lashed the windows, Ethan looked up from his screen. "Why do you do it?" he asked. "Build walls around everyone? You're not as cold as you pretend to be." Julian froze, his pen hovering over a contract. "You don't know me," he said, but the words felt hollow. Ethan stood, crossing the room to stand beside him. "Maybe I want to," he said, his voice low, laced with a challenge. Julian's breath caught. Ethan was too close, his warmth radiating, his eyes searching. For the first time in years, Julian didn't pull away. Their first kiss happened on that rooftop, under a sky bruised with twilight. It was tentative at first, then desperate, as if they'd both been starving for something they couldn't name. Julian's hands found Ethan's waist, pulling him closer, while Ethan's fingers tangled in Julian's hair. The city hummed below, but in that moment, it was just them. Two men, raw and unguarded, finding something real in a world built on pretense. But reality wasn't kind to moments like these. The next morning, Julian woke to a headline screaming across his phone. Billionaire Julian Carver's secret romance with Maid's son exposed. Paparazzi photos plastered the internet. Grainy shots of their rooftop kiss. Ethan's face unmistakable. Julian's blood ran cold. Someone had been watching. Someone had betrayed them. He stormed into the penthouse, where Ethan was already waiting, his face pale. "Did you do this?" Julian demanded, his voice shaking with anger and fear. Ethan's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You really think I'd sell you out? After everything?" His voice cracked, and Julian saw the hurt etched into his features. But doubt gnawed at him. He'd been burned before. Trust was a trap. The truth came in fragments. Rosa, tearful and trembling, admitted she'd overheard Julian's suspicions about Ethan and confided in a friend, who sold the story to a tabloid. It wasn't Ethan's fault, but the damage was done. The media frenzy painted Ethan as a gold digger, Julian as a reckless fool. Investors pulled back, board members whispered, and Julian's empire teetered. Yet amidst the chaos, Ethan didn't run. He stayed, fighting alongside Julian, drafting statements, facing the cameras with a defiance that made Julian's chest ache. One night, as they sat in the wreckage of Julian's office, Ethan reached for his hand. "I'm not here for your money," he said. "I'm here for you." Julian wanted to believe him, but trust was a leap he wasn't sure he could take. Not yet. The fallout was relentless. Julian's phone buzzed incessantly. Board members demanding answers. Reporters hounding for exclusives. and anonymous trolls spewing venom online. The narrative was brutal. Ethan, the opportunistic Maid's son, had seduced a billionaire to climb the social ladder. Julian's empire, built on his untouchable image, was cracking under the scrutiny. He sat in his office, staring at the city below, the weight of it all pressing against his ribs. Ethan, though, was unshaken. At 24, he carried a resilience Julian envied. He'd faced worse. Growing up gay in a small Ohio town, enduring slurs and sidelong glances, he'd learned to stand tall. Now, in the eye of this storm, he was a rock. "Let them talk," Ethan said, leaning against the desk, his arms crossed. "They don't know us." Julian wanted to believe it was that simple. But every headline chipped away at his control, exposing vulnerabilities he'd buried long ago. He'd come out as bisexual in his 20s, only to face rejection from mentors and mockery from peers. He'd vowed never to let love or the lack of it define him again. Yet here was Ethan, unraveling that vow with every glance, every touch. They worked late, drafting a response to the media. Ethan's fingers flew across his laptop, his focus razor-sharp. "We don't deny it," he said, not looking up. "We own it. Tell the world we're together, and let them choke on it." Julian stared, caught off guard by Ethan's fire. It was reckless, bold, and exactly what he needed to hear. The press conference was a gamble. Julian stood at the podium, the city skyline framing him, Ethan at his side. Cameras flashed, a sea of lenses trained on them. Julian's voice was steady, but his hand trembled as he gripped the podium. "Ethan Navarro is not a scandal," he said, his words cutting through the murmurs. "He's my partner, and I trust him with my life." The room erupted, questions flying like shrapnel. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here for his money or his name. I'm here because I love him." The word love hung in the air, raw and unapologetic. Julian's heart stuttered. Ethan hadn't said it to him yet, not like that. The cameras caught every flicker of emotion on Julian's face, and for once, he didn't care. The statement shifted the narrative, but not without cost. Investors pulled millions, citing instability. Julian's board pushed for damage control, suggesting he distance himself from Ethan. "He's a liability," one director hissed. Julian's response was ice cold. "Then so am I." At home, the penthouse felt different, warmer, despite the chaos. Ethan cooked dinner, a simple pasta dish, and they ate on the couch, the city glittering outside. "You didn't have to do that," Julian said, his voice soft. "Stand up there. Take the heat." Ethan shrugged, twirling his fork. "I wanted to. You're worth it." The words hit harder than Julian expected. He reached for Ethan's hand, their fingers lacing together. For the first time, Julian let himself imagine a life beyond the empire. A life with Ethan, unguarded, real. But doubt lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. Was Ethan too good to be true? The answer came unexpectedly. Late one night, Julian found Ethan's notebook, left open on the coffee table. Pages were filled with sketches, cityscapes, faces, moments and words. Poems, raw and unpolished, about love, fear, and finding home in someone else. One line stood out, written in Ethan's jagged scrawl. "Julian, you're the risk I'll always take." Julian's throat tightened. He'd spent weeks testing Ethan, searching for cracks, but the truth was in these pages. Ethan wasn't a threat, he was a gift. Julian closed the notebook, his hands shaking, and made a decision. He'd stop running from them. But the world wasn't done testing them. A new email landed in Julian's inbox, marked urgent. It was from an anonymous source, claiming to have proof Ethan had leaked sensitive data before the scandal broke. Attached was a grainy photo of Ethan meeting someone in a dimly lit cafe, handing over a flash drive. Julian's stomach dropped. He wanted to believe it was fake, but the evidence was damning. He confronted Ethan that night, the photo trembling in his hand. "Explain this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's face drained of color. "Julian, I swear, it's not what it looks like." But his voice wavered, and for the first time, Julian saw fear in his eyes. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Julian wanted to trust Ethan, to believe in the man who'd stood by him, who'd written poetry about him. But the photo was a knife, cutting through the fragile trust they'd built. "Tell me the truth," Julian said, his voice breaking. "Now." Ethan's story came in halting bursts. The man in the photo was his cousin, Diego, a struggling journalist. Ethan had given him a flash drive with family photos, nothing more. But Diego had a history of bending ethics for a scoop. "I didn't know he'd sell me out," Ethan said, tears brimming. "I didn't know he'd hurt you." Julian wanted to believe him, but the stakes were too high, the wounds too fresh. He sent Ethan home, needing space to think. Alone in the penthouse, Julian stared at the skyline, the city's lights blurring through his tears. He'd built an empire to protect himself, but it couldn't shield him from this, from the fear of losing the one person who saw him, not the billionaire, but the man. The next week was a blur of silence and regret. Julian buried himself in work, deflecting calls from his board, ignoring the tabloid's relentless churn. Ethan's absence was a void, his laughter, his defiance, his warmth gone from the penthouse. Julian kept the notebook, rereading Ethan's words, searching for clarity. "You're the risk I'll always take." The line haunted him, a reminder of what he stood to lose. He hired a private investigator to dig into the photo. The truth came fast. Diego had sold a fabricated story to a tabloid, using the innocent exchange to spin a lie. The flash drive held nothing but family memories, just as Ethan had said. Julian's relief was sharp, but it came with guilt. He doubted Ethan, pushed him away when he should have held him closer. He found Ethan at a small Brooklyn cafe, sketching in a corner booth. The sight of him, curly hair falling into his eyes, pencil moving with quiet purpose, made Julian's chest ache. "I was wrong," Julian said, sliding into the booth. Ethan looked up, his expression guarded but soft. "You didn't trust me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I get why, but it hurt." Julian reached for his hand, and this time Ethan didn't pull away. "I'm learning," Julian said. "I've spent my life expecting betrayal. But you're different." Ethan's eyes searched his, and for a moment, the world fell away. They talked for hours, unraveling the mess of doubt and fear, rebuilding what had been shaken. Their reconciliation wasn't perfect. Trust, Julian realized, wasn't a switch to flip. It was a choice made daily. They chose each other, again and again, through late-night talks, shared meals, and quiet moments on the rooftop. Ethan moved into the penthouse, his sketches filling the walls, his presence turning the sterile space into a home. But the world outside wasn't done with them. A new threat emerged, not from tabloids, but from within Julian's company. A rival executive, Claire Voss, saw the scandal as a chance to seize control. She leaked internal emails, painting Julian as distracted, unfit to lead. The board called an emergency meeting, demanding Julian step down or distance himself from Ethan to restore confidence. Julian faced the board, his voice steady, his resolve ironclad. "My personal life isn't your leverage," he said. "Ethan's not a liability, he's my strength. If you want me out, you'll lose everything I've built." It was a risk, but Julian was done hiding. The board backed down, but Claire didn't. She dug deeper, unearthing Julian's past, his foster care records, his buried bisexuality, twisting them into ammunition. Ethan, though, was unshaken. "Let her come for us," he said one night, his arms around Julian. "We're stronger than her lies." His confidence was infectious, and Julian found himself fighting not just for his company, but for the life they were building. They hired a PR team, countered Claire's leaks with transparency, and slowly, the narrative shifted. The public, hungry for authenticity, began to root for them. One evening, as they walked through Central Park, Ethan stopped under a canopy of cherry blossoms. "I wrote something for you," he said, handing Julian a folded page from his notebook. The poem was raw, tracing their journey: doubt, love, resilience. The last line hit like a vow. "In your truth I found mine." Julian pulled Ethan close, the park fading around them. "I love you," he said, the words spilling out, unguarded. Ethan's smile was radiant. "Took you long enough," he teased, but his kiss said everything. The fight wasn't over, but Julian no longer feared it. With Ethan by his side, he felt unbreakable. They were rewriting their story, not as a scandal, but as a testament to love's defiance. The battle for Julian's company intensified. Claire Voss wasn't just a rival. She was a predator, her ambition sharpened by years of being overlooked. She rallied shareholders, painting Julian as a liability, his relationship with Ethan a distraction from profit. "Carver's lost his edge," she told the board, her voice dripping with false concern. "He's chasing love instead of leading." Julian fought back, but the strain was relentless. Late nights blurred into early mornings, his team scrambling to counter Claire's moves. Ethan was his anchor, grounding him with quiet strength. One night, as Julian pored over financial reports, Ethan slid a mug of coffee onto the desk. "You're not alone in this," he said, his hand resting on Julian's shoulder. "We'll beat her together." Together became their mantra. Ethan wasn't just a partner, he was a strategist, his outsider's perspective cutting through corporate noise. He suggested a bold move, a public campaign showcasing Julian's vision, not just as a CEO, but as a man unafraid to live authentically. They launched a series of ads, raw, human stories of employees, innovators, and Julian himself, unapologetic about who he was. Ethan's sketches became the campaign's heart, their emotional depth resonating with millions. The campaign turned the tide. Shareholders, swayed by the public support, began to question Claire's narrative. But she wasn't done. She dug up an old contract, claiming Julian had breached it during the merger talks he'd faked to test Ethan. The accusation was flimsy, but it gave her leverage. The board scheduled a vote to oust Julian, and the clock was ticking. Ethan refused to let Julian face it alone. They spent days strategizing, combing through legal documents, building a case to expose Claire's lies. Rosa, too, stepped up, her loyalty to Julian unwavering. She'd felt guilty for her role in the initial leak, but now she was fierce, digging into Claire's past, uncovering whispers of her own unethical deals. The night before the vote, Julian and Ethan stood on the rooftop, the city sprawling below. "What if I lose everything?" Julian asked, his voice raw. Ethan turned to him, his eyes fierce. "You won't. But even if you do, you've got me. That's enough, isn't it?" Julian pulled him close, the weight of Ethan's words anchoring him. For the first time, he believed it might be. The boardroom was a battlefield. Claire presented her case with polished venom, but Julian was ready. He laid out the truth, the fake merger, his distrust, and how Ethan had proven him wrong. He spoke of love, not as a weakness, but as a strength that had made him a better leader. Ethan sat in the back, his presence a quiet force. When Rosa took the stand, revealing Claire's shady deals, the room shifted. The vote swung in Julian's favor, but narrowly. Claire's defeat was bitter, but she didn't vanish. She leaked one final story, a distorted version of Julian's past, painting him as unstable. The story gained traction, and Julian's stock plummeted. He could rebuild, he knew that, but the personal cost was heavier. Friends distanced themselves, and old wounds, his foster care days, the rejection he'd faced, resurfaced. Ethan saw the toll it took. One evening, he led Julian to a small art gallery in Brooklyn, where he'd secretly organized an exhibit of his sketches. The walls were alive with their story, moments of doubt, love, triumph. At the center was a portrait of Julian, his eyes fierce yet vulnerable, captioned simply, "The man I love." The room was packed with strangers, friends, even some of Julian's employees, all moved by the raw honesty of Ethan's work. Julian stood speechless, tears burning his eyes. "You did this for me?" he whispered. Ethan smiled, his hand finding Julian's. "For us," he said. The exhibit didn't erase the pain, but it reminded Julian what he was fighting for. Not just an empire, but a life shared with someone who saw him, flaws and all. The aftermath was a slow rebuild. Julian's company stabilized, but the scars of the fight lingered. He and Ethan faced the world together, their bond a quiet rebellion against the noise. They moved forward, not as a billionaire and an assistant, but as equals, their love a foundation stronger than any empire. One spring morning, Julian woke to find Ethan sketching at the kitchen counter, sunlight catching his curls. "Marry me," Julian said, the words spilling out before he could overthink them. Ethan's pencil froze, his eyes wide, then soft. "Only if you promise to trust me," he teased, but his voice trembled with emotion. They laughed, kissed, and planned a future neither had dared imagine. Their wedding was small, on a rooftop overlooking the city that had tested them. Rosa stood proud, her tears shining as she watched her son vow to love Julian forever. The guests, friends, allies, even a few former skeptics, cheered as they sealed their bond. The media called it a triumph, but to Julian and Ethan, it was simply theirs. Years later, Julian stepped back from his company, passing the reins to a new generation. He and Ethan started a foundation, supporting queer youth and artists, giving others the chance to tell their stories. Julian's fortune funded it, but Ethan's heart shaped it. They built a life of purpose, not just wealth, proving that love could outlast any scandal. The truth Julian froze at wasn't Ethan's betrayal, but his own fear. He'd pretended to sleep, testing a man who'd already proven his loyalty. In the end, Ethan taught him to wake up, to trust, to love, to live. And that was a truth worth building a life on.